theme of hospitality, I believe, is timely, given the vitriolic rhetoric and othering towards difference by both powerful political and religious leaders. I don't need to name names. You are fully aware of those who espouse this rhetoric and consequently dehumanize the stranger as other. My address is intentionally broad and a bit nuanced, as I'm trying to understand why so many are attracted to such othering of a stranger. I do believe that the concept of hospitality has been forgotten or lost altogether by many across the globe, the nation, and the state of Texas in particular. The stranger as other is at the door of the inn, and what will we do? Do we let them in? What if we let them in and they abuse their hospitality by harming or overstaying their invitation? What if the host nation not just closes the door, but bolts it shut, so no one who considered a stranger as other is allowed in? These questions and more is what this address is about. As Eve Gorel said several weeks ago in a class that Dr. Duke and I were teaching, what Brite teaches is not the answers per se, but how to ask good questions. She's on target, I believe. And like Eve, I also want to ask good questions, rather than coming up quickly with answers in this address. I understand the stranger as other in the broad sense, referring to that person or community who's perceived by a dominant group as not belonging. The dominant group sees itself as a norm and perceives of those lacking essential nationalistic or Christian identity markers as the other. The result is that the other is perceived as inferior and in some cases subhuman. This perception of the other unfolds, unfortunately, in many, many ways, such as the stranger. But one can easily apply it to someone who is different in race, social class, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, and origin, such as an immigrant or a refugee. Today we hear and see the stranger as other crossing all sorts of borders, both physically and metaphorically. What sort of hospitality should we extend to them? Are there certain folks who we should apply hospitality toward over others? And should we expect something in return if hospitality is extended? These are just a few of the questions on hospitality that are circulating the airwaves, coming across televisions, and even being preached at the pulpits these days. These questions have called on me to reread hospitality in light of the stranger as other. This is not an easy thing to discuss, since everyone here, I suspect, has a different understanding of what hospitality means and what it involves. In my address today, I present to you my particular reading on hospitality. Not to say that it is the only one, but it is one that I have been working with for our class next semester and an essay for publication. My hope today is that you can take something from this address as you prepare to embark on your respective ministries, journeys, and professions. I hope that you can pass on to your congregation and communities the tradition of asking critical questions about how one's faith, service, and reason inform how the stranger as other is constructed. What follows is a threefold critical reflection on hospitality. I shall first try to reframe the discussion on hospitality, follow with a discussion on the various modes of hospitality, and concluding with some final thoughts and directions. Framing the discussion on hospitality. As I have been suggesting, I'm not convinced that hospitality is an easy thing to nail down, as perhaps I thought it would be when I first embarked on this topic. As I read more and more on the theme by various scholars across the disciplines and drawing on cultural experience, I am more convinced that the concept of hospitality is very hard to grasp and convey. And I'm not convinced that there is one definitive meaning of hospitality. The scriptural texts do not work with one meaning, which I cannot get into now, nor has history and cultures worked with one definitive meaning, which partially explains why our ministers, public leaders, and family and friends constantly redefine hospitality. at the same time as they redefine their religious identity in this globalized world. Within their particular context, hospitality gets redefined as well. What is occurring, I think, is the development of various modes of hospitality. The use of various modes of hospitality is not new. One only needs to look in the stories of our sacred texts, traditions, history, and politics, and one can read that hospitality is understood and applied differently as it is done today in this hostile climate toward the stranger as other. I should not forget the element of cultural understanding of hospitality. How a person from another country understands it will differ how we may understand it. Even a person born in the Midwest may understand it differently from someone from the South. Even a Muslim may understand it differently than a Christian, to name a few examples. As you can hear, the dynamics of hospitality just gets more and more complex as one begins to understand it. The result of the constant redefining of hospitality leads to an either open-door notion of hospitality on one end of the continuum, or it leads to a closed-door notion on the other end of the continuum, or somewhere in between. Consequently, everyone is reading hospitality through a particular point of view, informed by their religious and cultural traditions and/or their politics. Just like I am doing, and I suspect you are doing the same this morning. Yet it does not mean that any notion of hospitality goes. Just like my understanding, interpretations of hospitality must be analyzed as whether it serves to benefit or not the stranger as other. For me, a criterion is whether equality and dignity is at play by both the host and the guest. This thought also has to be suspended for now. Allow me to throw one more issue into this framing of the question on hospitality, and that is the issue of risk. My working understanding is that hospitality without risk is not hospitality. When the doors are open, or even when the doors are closed, some risk factor is at play between the host and the guest. The host and the guest are the two dynamic components of hospitality. And in this address, the stranger as other is correlated with the guest. The host and the guest take some risk, for better or for worse, that some change will occur in their identities. That change may involve one's transformation of one's identity. Even if the host closes the door, risk is involved. The host, for example, either entertains to understand or can choose to create the risk of hostility for both the host and the guest. Hospitality does not always have to result in such radical consequences as Morel Rossello says in Post-Colonial Hospitality. But hospitality cannot be thought of without understanding that risk is part of what it means to be or not be hospitable, she asserts. Therefore, I do see hospitality engaged in some risk between the host and the stranger as other. For hospitality to operate in its best moments, both the host and the guest must take the risk of sitting down at the table, so to speak, and accepting the consequences of change in any exchange. Yet this is not easy. Hosts can put the guest in a delicate decision to simply abide by all the house rules. Or the guest can put the host in a delicate decision to concede to his or her worldview. Hospitality, says Rossello, is threatening. This is quite obvious in today's world. Yet because hospitality is threatening, I would argue, all attempts to extend and practice hospitality in a way that is liberating to both the host and the guest must still be attempted. The aim is equality and dignity. For not to do so, hospitality is not kept alive. Hospitality will exist hospitality will exist along the commercial ends of hospitality, where the host is simply nice to you because the host wishes to sell you a product. But hospitality, as reflected in our religious traditions, is not a commercial enterprise. Rather, it is an ethical and social exchange between humans, humans made in the image of God, seeking equality and dignity with one another. This framing of the question calls for further exploration along the various notions of hospitality. Such discussion will bring to the forefront the complexities around the concept of hospitality, and hopefully encourage you to redefine it in light of the current inhospitable rhetoric in the world today. Modes of hospitality. The word hospitality, according to Richard and Janice Haswell, in Hospitality as Authoring, who are actually drawing on the work of Emile Benveniste in Indo-European Language and Society, suggests that the word hospitality points to a, quote, intrinsic conflict of both fear and attraction, repulsion and union, end quote. In Greek, hospitality reads as philoxenia. Philo meaning love, and xenia meaning stranger. Thus the word points to the loving of the stranger. Keep in mind that the opposite of philoxenia is xenophobia, fear of the stranger. In Latin, the root of hospitality comes from two words, hostis, which suggests a stranger or enemy, and hostis with the connotation of stranger and foreigner. Thus, in hospitality's etymological history, one can thus detect some conflict between the host and the guest. Either you welcome one with open arms, or you turn away one with closed arms, or somewhere in between. This intrinsic conflict is part of what it means by hospitality. As Richard and Janice Haswell says, the host entertains with open arms, quote, offering attention, empathy, welcome, and understanding, end quote, to the guest or the stranger as other. And the guest or the stranger as other opens up the world to the host, quote, with the unfamiliar, the unknown, the unexpected, the new, the informative, says Richard and Janice Haswell. This intrinsic conflict is not always present in society's understanding of hospitality, and sometimes it is. The three modes of hospitality, ethical, political, post-colonial, either try to avoid intrinsic conflict, enter into negotiation with it, or engage with it. The ethical mode of hospitality. The ethical mode of hospitality works with the notion of hospitality of benevolence or generosity toward the stranger as the other. Its roots are reflected in the ancient biblical world and informs many religious leaders' and communities' understanding of hospitality. In the Christian context, some congregations have a ministry of hospitality that more often than not reflects this notion of hospitality. Food for the homeless, mission trips to build homes, or even a welcoming of new members is part of this understanding. This ethical notion of hospitality works with the theological principle that the stranger as other is made in the image of God. And it calls on believers to find equality and dignity in all persons, but sometimes equality and dignity for only a select group of people. In short, it means focusing on the stranger as other and providing food, water, and shelter to satisfy their essential needs. This ethical notion of hospitality is also found well after the first centuries with some of the great writers in Christianity, such as Augustine, who says in one of his sermons, quote, on this occasion of the concourse of so many strangers and needy and suffering people, let your hospitality and your good works abound. So you see, the ethical notion of hospitality is part of your religious tradition. It calls for the host to extend essential human needs to the stranger as other. And it calls on them to be part of their community. It calls on the host to love the stranger as the other, as the story of the Good Samaritan suggests. Such ethical notion of hospitality works with complete trust between the host and the stranger as other. What is assured in this relationship is an open dialogue with nothing in return from the stranger as other, for most cases. In other words, the host welcomes the stranger as other into the inn with no expectations. The trust, therefore, is friendly, but it does not go much further in most cases. What distinguishes this ethical notion of hospitality is the host always remains as host, and the stranger as other always remains as a guest. There is no reversal of positions psychologically or in terms of representation. It reminds me of communities, churches, and institutions wanting inclusion, but the dominant representation remains as host, and the stranger as other remains as guest. Compassion or inclusion is extended with the best intentions, but the roles of the host and the guest neither take a risk of knowing the stranger as other, and the stranger as other also is kept from knowing the host. Each component of the dynamic of hospitality is simply the same at the end. The host remains as host, and the guest remains as guest. The ethical notion of hospitality is the foundational understanding of hospitality, but like others, I would like to take it further. The political notion of hospitality. Another notion of hospitality at play in our community is what I call political notion of hospitality. Working with the ethical understanding of hospitality, political hospitality begins to place certain conditions on the dynamic of exchange between the host and the guest. Political hospitality is based on partial trust between the host and the guest, and is conditioned upon certain expectations between the host and the guest. The reception is friendly, but only because there is reciprocal agreement between the host and the guest. For instance, we may allow immigrants and refugees into the country on the condition that they are Christian, European, and heterosexual. Or we may allow Latinos into the congregations or institutions as long as they culturally assimilate, believe in what the dominant group believes, and learn English. In other words, political hospitality says as long as the host and the guest agree to certain terms, hospitality may function. Now, this notion of hospitality is also found in the Scriptures. For as long as you believe in Jesus as Christ, you are a child of God. This political understanding is also present in many congregations when they invite new folks into their congregations and institutions, including my own Roman Catholic tradition. You can come to the table as long as you agree to certain shared understandings. Or you can have food and shelter as long as you attend our service first. Or you can enter into our country as long as you stay in your place. The extreme position of the political notion of hospitality is when the guest takes on the role of the host, thinking he or she is always the host. When this occurs, this political understanding moves towards a colonial understanding of hospitality. The classic example of colonial hospitality occurred with the Native Americans in this country. Europeans came to guests thinking they were the host all along, confirmed by the Word of God and a notion of superiority. This colonial understanding is a distorted understanding of hospitality. The dire consequences of such colonial notion of hospitality are that the indigenous were either forced to behave, believe, or look like the supposedly new hosts, or were simply annihilated. Hospitality thus becomes not a friendly context, but a violent one, with no trust between the host and the stranger as other. Let us also not forget those who were brought forcefully, and continue to be brought forcefully for labor of all sorts to the U.S., and treated as the guests with no assurances and their behavior highly regulated. This is not hospitality, this is hatred. Both the political notion of hospitality and even the ethical notion of hospitality work with silence. Very little critical reflection is done regarding the roles of the host and the guest. They both keep silent because they wish to keep the power dynamic status quo. Again, I think this political notion is found in the Scriptures as well. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes hospitality is practiced in quite political ways, as reflected when a guest is protected only because someone else is sacrificed for safety or honor, as in the story of Lot sacrificing his daughters in Genesis. The danger here is that very little risk is taken to know the stranger as other. The host and the guest remain in their positions without any attempt to know one another, unless it is with conditions. Post-colonial hospitality. Another mode of hospitality, one in which I'm attracted to, is what Morel Rosella calls post-colonial hospitality. This notion of hospitality functions in a way in which the host and the stranger as other creates a space in which the host offers a bit of oneself to the other, and the other reciprocates by providing a bit of oneself to the host. Each individual has to give up something of oneself for hospitality to function. There is an element of ethical hospitality present in this understanding, in the sense that there is complete trust. There is also conditioned assurance in that both the host and the guest agree to a mutual change, with the understanding that experience will at times be uncomfortable, as sometimes painful, of being changed by the other. In short, there is a strong risk factor at play leading to the disappearance of the host-guest continuum. A byproduct of this exchange is if only temporarily, or reversing roles where the host becomes guest and the guest becomes host, even if ever even possible. I rarely see and hear this notion of hospitality at play in congregations, parishes, and institutions. When the quest for inclusion of the stranger is other, both the host and the guest give up something of their identity to form a new community. In the Scriptures, the foot washing scene in John comes to mind, where Jesus reverses the role of the disciples with a gesture of service. The host is willing to relinquish power, for example, while the guest is willing to relinquish something of his or her identity. What this something is what leads the host and the guest to take the risk of being changed. For each one of us, that relinquishing of something is most likely different. So I can't tell you what that is. You will have to find that out for yourself. When I hear leaders holding on to an essentialist understanding of Christianity, or what it means to be a U.S. American, this is an example of not wanting to relinquish something. They prefer to stay in an either-or world, with the host and the guest remaining in place. Now, these three notions of hospitality are not as clear-cut as I just explained them to be. They're constantly borrowing from one another and changing in their outlook based on the panoply of issues just discussed. I believe hospitality without risk is not hospitality. What I want you to take away today is that hospitality involves risk. In fact, you have already taken a risk of some sort when you were invited to Brite. Your presence did indeed change us, changed me, and I hope you feel changed yourself to reach a mutual space of equality and dignity. Along with my colleagues, we do hope that hospitality was extended to you over the years was one of equality and dignity. As you move into your next phase or direction in your vocations and professions, continue taking risks to know the stranger as other, whomever that other is. Don't let inhospitable rhetoric and action keep you from knowing the stranger as other. Don't let your congregation forget that they were once strangers in this land. And don't let your people forget that as Christians, taking a risk to know the other as stranger is part of our tradition. For hospitality without risk is just not hospitality. Thank you.
When today's candidates for graduation were beginning their studies at Brite, they entered into a community of care and commitment, of hospitality, with faculty, staff, and students who walked together the path that makes this day possible. The hooding ceremony is an opportunity for all of us present to surround each candidate with care and commitment that does not stop at this new threshold. We invite you to join in prayerful celebration as each candidate comes forward to receive a hood symbolic of their academic preparation for the opportunities and the challenges that lie ahead. Receiving the Master of Divinity degree, Sarah Christine. Sarah received her BA degree in psychology from Texas Tech University. She will serve as a chaplain at Juliet Fowler Communities.
Ronald Lee Branstetter. Ronald received a BS degree in electrical engineering and an MS degree in mechanical engineering from Oklahoma State University. He also received an MBA degree from the University of Texas at San Antonio. He is pursuing ministry opportunities in Granbury, Texas.
Casey Lynn Brown. Casey received BA degrees in religion and classical studies from Texas Christian University. He is pursuing the chaplaincy position and is in discernment about ordination in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Amanda Hyman. Amanda received a BA degree in psychology from Bethany College. She will pursue a license in professional counseling in preparation for work in pastoral counseling.
Annette received a Bachelor of Social Work degree from the University of North Texas. She will serve as chaplain bereavement coordinator at Universal Health Services and as deacon at St. Martin in the Fields Episcopal Church.
Joseph Wendell Neely Reynolds. Neely received a BA degree in music business from Dallas Baptist University. He will continue to serve as a supply pastor at First United Methodist Church, Maypearl, Texas, and First United Methodist Church, Britain, Texas.
John Warren Woodard. John received a BA degree in Pastoral Studies from Southwestern College. He will serve as a pastor at First United Methodist Church in Th.m, Texas.
Receiving the Master of Theology degree, Paul James Fusil. Paul received a BA degree in interdisciplinary studies from the University of West Florida and an M.Div degree from Brite Divinity School. He is pursuing doctoral studies in ancient Roman civilization and philosophy of religions.
Richard Andrew Thomas. Richard received a BA degree in religion from Texas Christian University and an M.Div from Brite Divinity School. Richard is pursuing further work in the academy. To our candidates for graduation and to families and friends whose sacrifice and support are heralded this day, congratulations.
Go now into God's world with joy and peace and love and hope. And the blessing of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, be with you all. Amen.